Ever find yourself wondering about the Star Trek multiverse, its concepts and characters? Do you spend your time thinking about how deep Star Trek goes? Hi, this is Trekpertise, where we discuss all things science fiction through the lens of Star Trek. I'd like to take some time to talk about an issue that has ruffled the feathers of many Star Trek fans around the world. This issue is the trouble with villains. You see, most Trek movies, and there have been 12 so far with the 13th in the works, always seem to have a villain. By now, it's expected. Who is playing the villain, people probably ask, upon hearing the news of a new Star Trek film, and rumors fly around Hollywood on casting this person or that. It's gotten almost as bad as the James Bond franchise.
Oh, Mr. Bond.
So, why are we using so many villains in Trek movies? Indeed, why use villains at all in any story? What's the purpose? Well, the villain or antagonist can serve as the primary obstacle for a story's central hero or protagonist. That villain typically embodies the opposite of the traits and characteristics that the story's protagonist may possess, forcing the protagonist to express their heroic traits.
I am what you see now.
I see more than that. I see what you could be. The man who is Shinzon of Remus and Jean-Luc Picard could never exterminate the population of an entire planet. He's better than that.
And a good villain can be elevated to a great character if they have a compelling motive that explains their role. For Star Trek, Khan takes the cake as top villain for most Trek fans and non-fans alike. And he is an interesting character overall.
I cannot help but be touched.
But why doesn't Nero or Shinzon or even, God, resonate with Trek fans as strongly as Khan? And if Khan is considered a high point for Trek villains, then why so long after Star Trek II is the Trek franchise still using villains in their movies? The answer to the first question on why post-Khan Trek villains don't seem to resonate is that these villains are typically two-dimensional, sometimes poorly written characters. Their motives just aren't very compelling.
They say time is the fire in which we burn.
Revenge is the motive most often cited, such as with Nero or the Khans. But sometimes plain old sport is also the reason cited, as when Commander Kruge and Captain Claw both, in turn, sort of chase down Captain Kirk because of, well, Klingon reasons.
Then I hope pain is something you enjoy.
These sort of villain characters might be okay once in a while for the franchise, but the problem of poorly written villains with less than compelling motivations is compounded when they are used again and again. And the movie portion of the Star Trek franchise suffers from this greatly.
My purpose, Christopher, is to not simply avoid the destruction of the home that I love, but to create a Romulus that exists, free of the Federation.
Generally, as far as Star Trek villains go, you get very little experimentation. However, it does show up, as is the case with the Borg Queen of First Contact. For what it's worth, I found the Borg much less compelling and much less scary after knowing a Borg Queen was part of the mix. But the Borg Queen is noteworthy as being a nice try, a different sort of villain. The answer to the second question on why Trek continues to pump out bad movie villains after Star Trek II is because the franchise is addicted to Khan. Seriously. With knowledge that Star Trek II seems to be the high point of Trek villain stuff, writers have seemingly pushed to mimic the conditions of the Kirk-Khan dichotomy in later Trek films, even getting to the point of just reusing Khan himself. Trek villain creation tends to be a conservative process. So, why so much distaste for Trek villains? Because while I find villains sometimes as cool as the next Trekkie, typically, I know that the heart and soul of Star Trek is usually expressed without the aid of a villain. Social progress, equality, curiosity, exploration of both the universe and the human condition, and probably the best place in television history to talk about the positive human potential. Star Trek shines brightest when it isn't bogged down in revenge epics on the average.
We have traveled far!
And as such, villains don't really push Trek to its fullest potential. This non-villain perspective is also on display in Trek movies, with films like Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, and my favorite, Star Trek The Motion Picture. As I've mentioned in previous Trexpertise episodes, this is my favorite Trek film of all time. It has everything: the unknown, the exploration of the human condition, an omnipotent machine, the birth of a new life form, and of course, a mysterious Spock. All this, and we didn't need a classic Trek villain to get us there. Despite all this talk against the premise of villains in Star Trek, we left out the greatest Trek villain of all time, who has never appeared in a movie. Gul Dukat. Some of you may disagree, naturally, and that's okay. But Dukat is awesome. Because he is a television villain instead of a movie villain, over the course of several years, you really get to understand his motives and his place in the Star Trek universe. As the audience, this allows for a real connection to the villain, which is the secret ingredient for a great bad guy. And if you want, I'll be happy to explain why Gul Dukat is so awesome in a future Trexpertise episode. Nevertheless, as far as movies are concerned, us Trekkies have villain fatigue. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to leave comments below, and subscribe to the channel for future episodes.